Welcome and good morning. Welcome to April 8th. And it's Friday too. So good morning and welcome. I pray that you've woken up to a wonderful day here. It is beautiful. It's a beautiful sunny Friday morning, and we're so grateful for another day that the Lord has given us to be in the land of the living. We say it all the time. We are in the land of the living. And so we want to thank God. So we are at the end of Psalm 78. We are going to be talking about part 3 of Psalm 78. And we're starting at verse 52, and we're going to go run it down all the way to verse 72. Psalm 78 has 72 verses, but it was because there was a lot to say. Asaph had a lot to say to the people. Why? Because they were making the same mistakes that that the people of of prior generations had made, and he saw the pattern, and he was like, "Look, guys, let's get right back to the place we're supposed to be." And so he wrote this very long psalm, which we've learned it's really the story of God. It is really the story of the Lord and his faithfulness versus the people's unfaithfulness. So in Psalm 78, again, it was a psalm of Asaph. And a little recap from yesterday is that, the Father tolerated and he put up with the sinful actions of the people of Israel. Right? They tested his patience. They were disobedient. They were demanding things from him. But most importantly, and something that Asaph mentioned several times, was that they just didn't believe in him. Of all the things that he did for them, of all the miracles that he showed towards them and put forth towards them, they still didn't believe. And so, and because in Asaph's time, his generation didn't believe, he felt like he had to recount the things that God had done and brought about on Egypt to bring them to where they were. And so each plague that God put on Egypt was a plague that dealt with the false gods of Egypt's time. Right? They worshipped lots and lots of different false gods. And so, for example, like when God sent the plague of locusts, and locusts came on the land, he was showing them that God was greater than their God that was called Set. And Set was supposed to be the protector of crops, but what did God do? He sent locusts to eat up all the crops, and that was a plague that judged them and showed that their God was false. And so every plague dealt with a different God that Egypt was worshiping. And so God put on this display of his power to show his people, look, I'm here to protect you. I'm here to defend you. I will go through at all costs to defend you, and you will not be harmed. You will not be harmed. And the last plague was, the plague of the firstborn. Because Pharaoh and his leaders were rebellious and reluctant to give up to God his firstborn, which was the nation of Israel, God said, okay, you don't want to give me my firstborn, then I'm going to take your firstborn. And that's what God did. And so God showed and displayed these wonders before his people. I look at it like he was flexing his arm of strength to show them that he was their mighty deliverer. And he wanted them to see that he was their defender and protector. But at the end of the day, they didn't really trust him. They didn't really put their whole faith on him. And so we read these scriptures to become something that we could learn from and not allow those same mindsets and those same attitudes that sometimes we deal with to lead us in our life. Okay, so verse 52, it says, in verse 52, but he brought his people out like a flock. He led them like a sheep through the wilderness. He guided them safely so they were unafraid. Isn't that beautiful? He guided them safely so they were unafraid. But the sea engulfed their enemies. And so he brought them to the border of his holy land, to the hill country his right hand had taken. And verse 55, he drove out nations before them and allotted their lands to them as an inheritance. He settled the tribes of Israel in their homes. And that is so beautiful, y'all. That is so beautiful. Do you see how protective and how loving and how caring the Father was? You know, before he made sure that before they got to the land that he drove out, he cleared out the nations that were already there. It says he drove out the nations before them and allotted their lands to them as an inheritance. He settled the tribes of Israel in their homes. You know, he had made a promise. He had made a promise that he was going to bring them to a land of milk and honey, right? He promised Abraham that he would have descendants as numerous as the stars. And here the Father was fulfilling that promise. He took them out of slavery. He brought them into a land. He cleared out the nations of those lands. He made sure that the land was full of milk and honey. Right, so that they can grow. He brought them, he settled them into their homes, and he brought them out safely so that they can continue to grow, to multiply. So he was fulfilling his end of the bargain. He was fulfilling his promise, and we can learn from this that God will fulfill his promises to us. So it's up to us. We have to remember and not forget. Right? And that's how Asaph started this psalm. He was reminding us of God's faithfulness, that there's not a promise he's not going to keep. It doesn't matter how bad it looks. It doesn't matter how long it takes, right? For Israel, it took 400 years. For 400 years, they were in slavery. Can you imagine? For 400 years, that's all they knew. All they knew was to be slaves, generation after generation. They were forced into slavery by the Egyptians. And I believe that God probably was just waiting for somebody to step up. I believe that God was reaching out to people and saying, "Would you deliver my people out of Egypt? Can I use you to bring them out? Ooh, that's good. Can I use you to bring them out?" But no one stepped up to the plate. No one stepped up to the plate until Moses. And I bet that God did to Moses what he did to others. But Moses stopped, right? God showed him a burning bush. And Moses stopped. And God spoke to him out of the burning bush. So right there, that was a miracle right there. Right? And Moses responded and was chosen to bring the people out. And God probably reached out to others. But in those 399 years, in the 400th year, Moses was the only one that responded. And God used him to bring his people out of slavery. And it's the same for us. God is always looking for people he can use, people he can raise up. And I say this with much, much conviction because I feel this whole psalm has given me much conviction about my own life, about the many times God has spoken to me and I didn't quite get it. I didn't quite get it. I stood back. And so, he will use people that will say, "Okay, here I am, Lord. Send me." And that's what Moses did. Moses stepped up to the plate and God was able to fulfill his promise. But if Moses had not stepped up to the plate, who knows how much longer the people of Israel would have been suffering as slaves in the land of Egypt. So, what promise has God made to you today that is waiting to unfold? You know, whatever it is, let's not be like the people of Israel and doubt. Let's believe God that He will do exceedingly more than we can ask or think. All right? Okay, verse 56. And still talking about Israel here. It says, but they put God to the test and rebelled against the Most High. They did not keep His statutes. Like their ancestors, they were disloyal and faithless, as unreliable as a faulty bow. What an analogy Asaph uses here. They were unreliable like a faulty bow. And again, this whole psalm, Asaph has been talking about God's faithfulness versus Israel's faithfulness, right? And yesterday we talked about all the things that Israel had done as they sinned, right? Verse 32, it has said that they kept on sinning, and in spite of His wonders, they did not believe, right? In verse 42, Asaph said how often they rebelled against Him in the wilderness and grieved Him in the wasteland. Asaph also said again and again they put God to the test. They vexed the Holy One. They tempted. They wore out His patience, the patience of the Most Holy One. And in verse 42, Asaph told us they did not remember His power. They just didn't remember His power. And so here Asaph is going to share a little bit more detail about their unfaithfulness. He said they put Him to the test. They rebelled against Him. They were disloyal and faithless. That's been the theme of this entire psalm, Psalm 78. They have been faithless, an unfaithful people. God had brought them successfully out into the promised land. But once they got there, they forgot all He had done. They forgot everything He did for them. And so Asaph says that they were an unreliable as a faulty bow. You know, like those bow and arrows. That's what he was talking about. In other words, he was saying they weren't serving God's purpose. They weren't serving God's purpose. They weren't serving their own purpose. A faulty bow, right, is when you take a bow and you pull it back, it's supposed to shoot, right? The bow is what gives the arrow the power to move. And so the bow was supposed to move, but it didn't move. It was defective. It was no good. And that's what Asaph was describing the people of Israel. They were supposed to be His holy people, set apart, a people devoted to God, obedient to Him, right? And faithful to Him. But they were not acting like that. They weren't acting like that. They were acting like the nations around them, right? They didn't regard Him as God. They were serving other idols. They wanted His protection. They wanted His benefits, but they didn't want a commitment. Verse 58, they angered Him with their high places. They aroused His jealousy with their idols. And that's what they were doing, right? They were cheating on Him. They were cheating on Him. That's why He described them as a faulty bow. They were supposed to be set apart. A people that does things differently. A people that act differently. But they were cheating on Him with their high places, meaning that they were building altars and sacrifices to false gods. And it was like, you know, God is the faithful spouse working hard to protect the family, but the spouse is in bed at home with another lover. It's horrifying. It was horrifying. It is the greatest betrayal. But this is what Israel was doing. God had taken such good care of them, and He led them through an overwhelmingly terrible wilderness. He protected them from the wild animals in the wilderness, right? He escorted them day and night with the cloud and through the fire. He got them into the promised land. He protected them. He made sure they ate. But when they got there, they started to set up altars to worship false gods. How often do we turn? God does things for us and then we turn to false things. We put our trust in false things. That's what we have to be careful. Because we say, oh, well, we don't worship idols. We have to be careful. Let's leave it at that. Verse 59. When God heard them, he was furious. He rejected Israel completely. He heard them because they were doing shouts and who knows what. Who knows what their rituals caused them to do. When he heard them, he was furious. He rejected Israel completely. He abandoned the tabernacle. He abandoned the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent he had set up among the people. Verse 61, he sent the ark of his might into captivity, his splendor into the hands of the enemy. Verse 62, he gave his people over to the sword. He was furious with his inheritance. And so this part here, Asaph is recounting what happened to the people of Israel during the time of Eli, when Eli was the priest and Eli was governing the people. Eli was just letting the people run rampant. Like they were just doing whatever. His own sons were having, doing prostitution in the temple. Like they were going crazy. And what happened? God was furious. He said it was furious with his people, and he allowed the Philistines to come in and attack Israel. And what happened? They captured the Ark of the Covenant. They captured the Ark. The Ark of the Covenant represented his presence. And by them capturing the Ark of the Presence, these ungodly people capturing the Ark of the Presence, he removed his presence from them. And so one of Eli's daughter-in-laws gave birth, and she gave birth, and when she heard that the Ark of the Presence was captured, and she said she named her baby Ichabod, which meant, the glory has been removed. God removed his glory from his people. He was like, why am I going to stick around to these faithless people that don't want him? He does so much for them, but they didn't want him. So he removed his presence from them, and they suffered a really long time. Verse 63, fire consumed their young men, and their young women had no wedding songs. Their priests were put to the sword, and the widows could not weep. The women, it says the women had no wedding songs. Why? Because all the men were dying off. All the young men were dying off. They were being captured. So the women had no one to marry. Verse 64 again. Their priests were put to the sword, and their widows could not weep. Then the Lord awoke as from sleep, as a warrior wakes from the stupor of wine. He beat back his enemies. He put them to everlasting shame. Verse 67, then he rejected the tents of Joseph. He did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. So by the time all of that went down, Israel had spent years and years and years serving false gods. God was just like, hands off. But then a new generation started to come up, and he saw something, right? He saw something in them. He started fresh with a new generation. And even though he had been angry with those prior generations, because they abandoned their faith, they abandoned their love of God, he didn't give up completely on them. He found himself a man after his own heart. He found a man who was going to love and serve him wholeheartedly. And he said, you know what? I reject Ephraim. Ephraim was supposed to be a tribe of leadership. Joseph was supposed to be a tribe of leadership, and God said, you know what, I'm done with y'all. I am done with y'all. I'm not dealing with y'all anymore. I have found the tribe of Judah, and I am going to start with them. They were also a leadership tribe. And he says, the Bible says, he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loved. Verse 69, it says, he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth that he established forever. Verse 70, and he chose David his servant and took him from the sheep pens, from tending the sheep. He brought him to be the shepherd of his people Jacob, of Israel his inheritance. And verse 72, this is the last verse, y'all. This is the last verse. And David shepherded them with integrity of heart, with skillful hands. He led them. And so Asaph was talking to the people because remember, during his time, the kingdom was divided. There was the kingdom of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Judah was in the southern kingdom, and Asaph was reminding the people, like, this was the kingdom that God chose, the tribe of Judah, to lead. Why, the northern kingdom, they split off. They're like, we're going to be Israel, but they were the people that were following after other gods. And Asaph was reminding the people, like, look, from the very beginning, God chose a people for himself, and he ended up with Judah because Judah followed him. The tribe of Judah followed him. David led his people with integrity of heart. And so Asaph was recounting the story, God's story, that even though the people were utterly unfaithful, God remained faithful to his people. God remained faithful, and he is still faithful to his people. So, in closing, what can we learn from this entire psalm? From all these verses, 72 verses, what can we learn? Number one, again, we just said it, that God is faithful. He keeps his promises. He keeps his promises. Even when we're not faithful, God keeps his promises. And we also learned to look at Israel and the way they were and let them be a mirror to us so that we're not like them, right? So that we don't act like them, that we forget God's power. We don't believe in his promises. We forget that if he did miracles before, he'll do them again. We learn how not to fall away from him the way they did. And it teaches us to stay guarded, because he's not going to always pursue. At some point, his patience will run out. When we start chasing other things, when we make people our gods, or medications our God, or reading the horoscope, or all of these things that are not from him, when we put our trust in those things, to hear from those things and to give for those things to give us comfort, then we've acted like them, right? He will not always chase after us if we're disobedient, and we're going to be given over to our disobedience if we don't return to him. But in the end, God is faithful. He will always be faithful. Amen. Amen. Okay. That is the end of Psalm 78, verses 1 through 72. I can't believe I had a good time, because it totally convicted me. This whole time, this entire chapter convicted me of my own life. Give me something to see myself, a reflection of myself in the disobedience of the people of Israel. All right. Listen, y'all, have a great weekend. I will, God willing, see you on Monday. And I pray you have a great weekend. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine on you. The Lord lift up his countenance toward you and be gracious to you. And the Lord give you Shalom. Ciao, ciao. Have a great weekend. Bye.